The blood-red sun dipped low on the horizon as Hannah Green wiped the dust from her eyes, her 32 years of life feeling more like 100 as she sat motionless on her weathered porch in Cottonwood Springs, Colorado. The year was 1879, and for the third consecutive summer, she faced the coming night alone. The sway of the rocking chair beneath her had become as familiar as breathing, its creaking rhythm a metronome marking the slow passage of time since William's death. 3 years a widow, and the ranch they'd built together was slipping through her fingers like the fine dust that coated everything in this drought-stricken corner of the territory. Hannah's gaze drifted to the distant mountains, their purple silhouettes stark against the fading daylight. The cattle were fewer this season, the crops struggling in fields that had seen too little rain. Another month, maybe two, and she might have to admit defeat, sell what remained, and return east to her sister in Pennsylvania. The thought alone made her chest tighten with something akin to physical pain. Her hand absently traced the worn wood of the porch railing, fingertips following the grain patterns William had admired when they'd built this place. "Good, solid oak," he'd said. "This'll outlast us both." How right he'd been, though not in the way either of them had imagined. The distant sound of hoofbeats broke through her melancholy, and Hannah straightened in her chair, squinting against the setting sun. Visitors were rare this far from town, especially this close to nightfall. Her hand instinctively moved toward the shotgun propped against the wall behind her. As the rider drew closer, Hannah could make out a tall figure atop a chestnut mare. Not one of the local ranchers she knew. This man sat easy in the saddle, with the comfortable posture of someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. His broad shoulders were silhouetted against the darkening sky, and a well-worn hat shaded his features. Hannah stood, her calloused hand gripping the shotgun firmly as the stranger approached her gate. He dismounted with fluid grace, removing his hat and revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, but handsome in a rugged way. He couldn't have been more than 35. "Evening, madam," he called, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." "That depends on your business here," Hannah replied, not lowering the shotgun but not raising it either. The man smiled, seemingly unfazed by her caution. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a cloth-covered bundle and what appeared to be a small bouquet of wildflowers, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the dusty landscape. "Name's Jackson Garner," he said, approaching slowly with his offerings held before him. "I've taken over the Pearson place about 10 miles east, thought I should introduce myself to my neighbors." He lifted the cloth bundle slightly, "Brought some fresh bread, and these flowers. Well, they caught my eye along the trail, seemed a shame to leave them withering in this heat." Hannah's grip on the shotgun loosened slightly. The Pearson place had been abandoned for nearly a year after old man Pearson had died, and his children had sold off the livestock and returned to St. Louis. "You bought that rocky piece of land?" she asked, surprise momentarily overriding her caution. Jackson chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "Got it for a fair price. The land's got good water, and that's worth more than gold out here." Hannah couldn't argue with that logic. She slowly set the shotgun aside and stepped forward to the edge of the porch. "Hannah Green," she offered, extending her hand in a businesslike gesture. Was my husband's ranch. He passed 3 years ago." Jackson's expression softened as he climbed the 3 worn steps to her porch. Up close, Hannah could see his eyes were a clear, steady blue, like the Colorado sky on a winter morning. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Green." He handed her the bread and flowers with a respectful nod. "And I admire anyone who can keep a ranch going in these parts, especially alone." The bread was still warm, its yeasty aroma making Hannah realize she hadn't eaten since morning. The wildflowers were desert columbines and Indian paintbrush, their delicate petals somehow unbroken despite the journey. "Thank you," she said, suddenly conscious of her dust-streaked face and faded calico dress. "Would you care for some coffee? Least I can do for a neighbor who brings gifts." Jackson smiled, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Hannah felt something other than weariness settle in her chest. "I'd be obliged, Mrs. Green," he said, hanging his hat on the porch post. "Mighty obliged indeed." Hannah turned toward the door, cradling the unexpected gifts against her chest. As she stepped into the dimness of her home, she hesitated, then glanced back over her shoulder. "It's Hannah," she said quietly. "Just Hannah." The kitchen was small but neat, every surface scrubbed clean despite the constant battle against dust. Hannah busied herself with the coffee pot, acutely aware of the tall stranger who now filled her doorway. It had been so long since she'd entertained anyone beyond the occasional ranch hand or traveling salesman that the simple act of hosting felt foreign. "Please sit," she said, gesturing to the sturdy wooden table that dominated the room. "Coffee won't take but a minute." Jackson removed his dusty riding coat and draped it carefully over the back of a chair before settling into it. His eyes traveled respectfully around the room, taking in the modest furnishings and the few personal touches that marked it as a home rather than just a shelter. A crocheted doily on the sideboard, a pair of well-worn books on a small shelf, a faded daguerreotype in a simple frame. "You've kept a fine place here," he observed. "Most ranches I've seen run by widows or bachelors tend toward the Spartan." Hannah placed the flowers in a glass jar with water, arranging them with more care than was strictly necessary. "My husband William believed a proper home was worth the effort, no matter how far from civilization." She paused, surprised at how easily William's name had come to her lips. Usually, she avoided speaking it aloud, as if the sound itself might reopen barely healed wounds. "Sounds like a man of principle," Jackson said. "He was." Hannah placed the coffee pot on the stove and turned to face her visitor fully for the first time. "Now, Mr. Garner, Jackson, please." "Jackson," she amended with a slight nod. "What brings a man to buy the Pearson place?" "It's not known for being particularly hospitable land." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I've spent the last 15 years driving cattle from Texas to Kansas, Montana, Wyoming, wherever they needed to go. Slept under the stars more nights than I can count. Figured it was time to put down some roots before I turn into a piece of rawhide myself. And you chose Colorado. I passed through these parts a few years back. Something about the mountains spoke to me." His eyes met hers steadily. "Told myself if I ever had the chance to stop roaming, this is where I'd do it." The coffee began to boil, and Hannah turned back to the stove, grateful for the moment to compose herself. There was something in his direct gaze that unsettled her, though not unpleasantly. "Sugar?" she asked, pouring the dark liquid into 2 cups. "Just black, thank you." Their fingers brushed as she handed him the cup, a momentary contact that sent an unexpected warmth up her arm. Hannah withdrew quickly, taking her own cup and sitting across from him at the table. "So you're planning to raise cattle?" she asked, steering the conversation to safer ground. Jackson nodded, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "Some cattle, yes, but I'm thinking of horses primarily. There's good money in breeding and training stock for the army and for the stage lines. Horses require good water and decent grazing. The Pearson place has 3 natural springs that run year-round, even in drought, and I've got ideas about irrigation that might improve the grazing." He took a sip of coffee. "This is excellent, by the way." Hannah acknowledged the compliment with a slight inclination of her head. "Horses are smart business if you know what you're doing, less affected by the market fluctuations than cattle." "You know ranching," he observed, respect evident in his tone. "I should hope so." "I've been at it since I was 18. Hannah cut 2 slices from the bread he'd brought and placed one before him on a plate. "My father raised horses in Pennsylvania. When I married William and moved west, we started with 6 mares and a stallion, built up to nearly 50 head before." She trailed off, the familiar ache of loss momentarily stealing her words. "Before the hard times came," Jackson finished for her, his voice gentle. Hannah nodded, grateful for his understanding. "Drought 3 years running." William took our best stock to Denver, hoping for better prices than we could get locally. On the return journey, there was a flash flood in a canyon pass. They found him in the wagon 2 days later. Jackson's face showed genuine sorrow. "I'm truly sorry, Hannah. Thank you." She straightened her shoulders slightly. "I've managed to keep most of the ranch, though I've had to sell off land piece by piece. The remaining horses are good stock, but without adequate grazing." She shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the challenges she faced. They ate in comfortable silence for a few moments, the homemade bread surprisingly light and flavorful. "Did you bake this yourself?" Hannah asked, curiosity getting the better of her. Jackson's laugh was unexpected and warm. "Lord, no. Mrs. Abernathy in town took pity on me when she heard I was setting up bachelor quarters. Said no man should have to survive on his own cooking when starting a ranch. I suspect she's hoping I'll take a liking to her daughter, but that's a different matter." Hannah found herself smiling in response. "Eliza Abernathy makes the best bread in the county, and her daughter Lucille is considered quite a catch, so I've been told repeatedly." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "But I didn't ride 10 miles to your doorstep to discuss Lucille Abernathy." The directness of his statement caught Hannah off guard. "Oh, and what did bring you all this way, Mr. Garner? Surely not just neighborly courtesy." Jackson set down his coffee cup and regarded her thoughtfully. "Honestly, I heard about your ranch in town. About how you've managed to hold on despite everything. I admire that kind of determination." He hesitated, then continued, "And I have a proposition that might benefit us both if you're willing to hear it." Hannah's guard immediately rose. She'd had her share of propositions, since becoming a widow from men offering to buy her land at insulting prices to those suggesting marriage as if they were doing her a favor. "What kind of proposition?" she asked, her voice cooling noticeably. Jackson seemed to sense her change in demeanor. "A business proposition only, I assure you. I have experience and some capital. You have established stock and knowledge of local conditions. I thought perhaps we might consider combining our resources in some way. A partnership of sorts." Hannah studied him, trying to discern his true intentions. His face remained open, his gaze steady. "That's a mighty big suggestion from someone I've just met," she said finally. "Ranching partnerships are complicated even between lifelong friends." "I understand your caution," he replied, "and I'm not asking for an answer tonight. Just for you to consider the possibility." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "These are references from banks I've done business with, ranchers I've worked for. I'm not asking you to take me on faith alone." Hannah accepted the paper but didn't unfold it. "I'll think about it," she said, making no promises. "But I should warn you, I'm not in the habit of entering into business arrangements lightly." "I'd be concerned if you were," Jackson replied, finishing his coffee. "A woman who's held onto a ranch alone for 3 years in these conditions is someone who thinks carefully about her decisions." The sincere respect in his voice caught Hannah by surprise. Most men spoke to her with either condescension or thinly veiled impatience, as if her widowhood had somehow diminished her understanding of the business she'd helped build from the ground up. As the conversation continued, the sky outside darkened completely, and Hannah lit the oil lamp on the table. Its warm glow softened the angles of Jackson's face as he spoke about his travels, sharing stories of cattle drives and the characters he'd encountered along the way. Despite herself, Hannah found him to be engaging company. His tales neither exaggerated for effect nor told with the self-importance she'd come to expect from many of the men she knew. When he finally glanced at the small clock on the shelf and announced he should be on his way, Hannah was surprised to realize nearly 2 hours had passed. "It's a dark ride back to the Pearson place," she observed, rising to clear the cups from the table. "The moon won't be up for another hour yet." "I've ridden darker trails," Jackson said, reaching for his coat, "and Sadie, my horse, knows her way home better than I do most days." Hannah walked him to the door, suddenly aware of how quiet the house would be after he left. At the threshold, Jackson turned to her, hat in hand. "Thank you for your hospitality, Hannah," he said, his voice low. "It means more than you might guess to be welcomed at a neighbor's table after years on the trail." "Thank you for the bread and flowers," she replied, finding herself oddly reluctant to end the evening. "It was a kindness I didn't expect." Jackson settled his hat on his head, the brim shadowing his features in the porch lantern's light. "I'd like to call again if I may. Perhaps in a few days, when you've had time to consider my proposal." Hannah nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite the unexpected flutter in her chest. "That would be acceptable." He stepped off the porch and untied his mare from the hitching post. With practiced ease, he swung into the saddle, gathering the reins in one hand. Looking down at her, he smiled, the gesture transforming his weather-worn face. "Good night, Hannah Green," he said softly. "Sleep well." As she watched him ride away, his silhouette gradually disappearing into the darkness, Hannah realized she was still holding the folded paper with his references. She should have been annoyed at having to deal with yet another decision, another potential complication in her already difficult life. Instead, she found herself looking forward to reading them by lamplight before bed, and wondering what kind of man Jackson Garner really was, beyond the polite, attentive neighbor who had appeared so unexpectedly on her doorstep with bread and wildflowers. The next morning dawned clear and hot, the merciless Colorado sun already baking the land as Hannah made her way to the small stable behind the main house. The references Jackson had left with her had proven impressive: letters from a cattle baron in Texas, a bank president in Cheyenne, and even a brief note from a cavalry officer praising his horse trading skills. She'd fallen asleep with more to think about than she'd had in months. The daily chores waited for no one, however, and Hannah set to work with the same determination that had carried her through the past 3 years. The remaining horses needed tending, the vegetable garden required watering, and the chicken coop needed cleaning. It was the life of constant labor she'd grown accustomed to, though it had been easier when shared with William and the 2 ranch hands they'd once been able to employ. By midday, with sweat dampening her shirt and a smudge of dirt across her forehead, Hannah paused to drink from the well bucket. The heat shimmered across the distant pasture where her remaining 8 horses grazed on the sparse vegetation. Good animals all, descended from the original stock she and William had brought west. Pride of her ranch, though lately more of a liability than an asset with feed costs rising and their value dropping in the poor economy. A partnership. The word kept returning to her thoughts as she worked. Jackson Garner's proposition wasn't entirely without merit. Combined resources might allow for irrigation improvements, better breeding stock, shared labor costs. But partnerships required trust, and trust wasn't something Hannah gave easily anymore, not since the banker in town had tried to swindle her out of her water rights shortly after William's death. The sound of approaching riders pulled her from her thoughts. Shading her eyes against the sun, Hannah counted 3 men on horseback approaching from the direction of town. She recognized 2 immediately, Sheriff Thomas Mercer and his deputy, young Silas Cook. The 3rd man was unfamiliar, his expensive suit and city hat marking him as an outsider. Hannah wiped her hands on her apron and walked to meet them, wariness settling in her stomach. Sheriff visits rarely brought good news. "Afternoon, Mrs. Green," Sheriff Mercer called as they approached. A decent man by most accounts, though firmly in the pocket of the town's business interests. "Sheriff," Hannah acknowledged with a nod. "What brings you out this way?" The men dismounted, and the sheriff removed his hat in a gesture of courtesy. "This here is Mr. Elliot Bradford from the First National Bank of Denver." The well-dressed man stepped forward, his pale skin suggesting he spent little time outdoors. "Mrs. Green, a pleasure to make your acquaintance." Hannah didn't offer her hand. "What business does a Denver bank have with me, Mr. Bradford?" Bradford cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with her directness. I represent the interests of several investors who have purchased the outstanding loans previously held by Cottonwood Springs Mercantile and Banking Company. A cold feeling settled in Hannah's chest. William had taken out a substantial loan to expand their operation just months before his death. She'd been making minimum payments to Harlan Wilson at the local bank, barely keeping ahead of the interest. "I've made every payment on time," she said, her voice steady despite her rising concern. Bradford produced a document from his breast pocket. "Yes, that's been noted." However, the terms of the original loan included a clause allowing for review and potential acceleration of the debt after 3 years. That period expired last month. "Meaning what, exactly?" Hannah demanded, though she feared she already knew. "The new holders of the note have decided to call in the loan in full. You have 30 days to repay the outstanding balance of $842, plus applicable interest. The amount might as well have been $8,000 for all Hannah's ability to pay it. Every spare cent had gone into keeping the ranch operational through the drought. "This is outrageous," she said, fighting to keep her voice level. "You know full well I can't produce that sum in 30 days. Sheriff Mercer looked uncomfortable but said nothing. His deputy studied the ground, avoiding her eyes. Bradford's expression was impassive. "I understand this is difficult news, Mrs. Green. However, the terms were clearly stated in the original agreement your husband signed." "My husband never would have agreed to terms that could bankrupt us at the whim of some faceless investors in Denver." Hannah's hands had balled into fists at her sides. "Nevertheless, these are legally binding obligations." Bradford returned the document to his pocket. "Should you fail to meet the payment deadline, the bank will be forced to initiate foreclosure proceedings on this property." The threat hung in the air between them, stark and ugly. Hannah felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet, but she kept her spine straight and her gaze unwavering. "Who are these investors?" she asked. "I have a right to know who's trying to take my home." Bradford hesitated. "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information." "I'm merely the messenger." "Convenient," Hannah said bitterly. "Well, you've delivered your message, Mr. Bradford. Now I'll thank you to get off my land." The banker looked to Sheriff Mercer, who nodded slightly. "We've done what we came to do, Elliot. Mrs. Green, I am sorry about this. If there's anything I can do—" "Unless you can produce $800, there's nothing you can do," Hannah replied coldly. "Good day, gentlemen." She turned and walked back toward the house, refusing to watch them mount up and ride away. Only when she was certain they were gone did she allow her shoulders to slump, leaning against the porch post for support as the reality of her situation sank in. $842. An impossible sum. She could sell the horses, but in the current market, they'd fetch maybe half that amount. The remaining cattle might bring another 100 if she was lucky. The land itself was her only real asset, and now it seemed she would lose it regardless. Hannah sank onto the porch steps, the same spot where she'd sat just yesterday when Jackson Garner had ridden up with his bread and flowers and unexpected proposition. The memory of their conversation brought a new thought to her mind: a partnership, access to capital, resources combined. Was this what he'd heard in town? That her ranch was about to be foreclosed upon? Was his friendly overture just a calculated move to gain control of her land more cheaply than buying it outright? The thought sent a wave of bitter disappointment through her, followed quickly by anger at herself as much as at him. For a brief moment, she'd allowed herself to believe in simple kindness, only to be reminded that in this harsh land, every action had an underlying motive, every gesture a price. Standing abruptly, Hannah made her decision. She would ride to the Pearson place tomorrow and confront Jackson Garner directly. If he knew about the loan and was trying to take advantage of her situation, she would see it in his eyes. And if by some chance his offer had been genuine. Hannah shook her head. She couldn't afford the luxury of trust, not now. But neither could she afford to dismiss any possibility that might save the ranch she and William had poured their lives into building. With renewed determination, she returned to her chores, working well past sunset as if physical labor might somehow forge a path through the impossible situation facing her. The following morning, Hannah rose before dawn, her mind made up. After feeding the animals and checking the irrigation ditch that supplied her small garden, she saddled her most reliable gelding, a sturdy buckskin named Copper. Dressed in her best riding skirt and a clean blouse, with her hair neatly braided and pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, she set out for the Pearson Ranch. The 10-mile ride took her through rolling terrain that grew progressively more rugged as she approached the eastern foothills. Despite the early hour, the heat was already building, the sun climbing steadily in a cloudless sky. Hannah's thoughts churned as rhythmically as Copper's hoofbeats on the packed earth. What exactly would she say to Jackson Garner? How could she determine his true intentions without revealing the desperate nature of her situation? The banker's ultimatum had shifted everything, transforming what might have been a careful business negotiation into a last-ditch effort to save her home. As she crested a small rise, the Pearson Ranch came into view below her. Hannah reined Copper to a stop, surprised by what she saw. In the year since old man Pearson's death, the place had fallen into disrepair. She'd expected to find it much the same, a ramshackle house, tumble-down barn, and overgrown fields. Instead, signs of renewal were everywhere. The house had a fresh coat of whitewash, the barn roof had been repaired, and a new corral stood beside it, containing at least a dozen horses. A small stream had been diverted to create a larger watering pond, and a man, Jackson, she presumed, was working with a team of draft horses to clear a field of rocks. Hannah watched for a moment, noting the methodical way he worked, speaking quietly to the massive animals as they pulled a stone boat loaded with field stones. This wasn't the work of someone looking for a quick profit. This was the labor of a man building something meant to last. She nudged Copper forward, descending the slope toward the ranch. Jackson looked up at her approach, shading his eyes against the sun. Recognition dawned on his face, followed by a smile that seemed genuinely pleased. "Hannah," he called, securing the draft team before walking to meet her. "This is an unexpected pleasure." Hannah dismounted, taking in the improvements up close. "You've been busy," she observed, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Jackson glanced around, his expression a mixture of pride and rueful acknowledgement of how much remained to be done. "Early days yet, but it's coming along. Pearson let it go to seed his last few years. I can see that." Hannah led Copper to the watering trough, allowing him to drink while she gathered her thoughts. "I read your references." And Jackson wiped his brow with a bandana, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle from years of physical labor. "They're impressive," she admitted. "Though I notice you've moved around quite a bit. Texas, Wyoming, Montana." "The life of a drover," he said with a slight shrug. "But as I told you, I'm looking to put down roots now. At some point, a man tires of having no place to call his own." Hannah met his gaze directly. "Did you know the bank is foreclosing on my ranch?" The question hung between them, blunt and unadorned. Jackson's expression shifted to one of genuine surprise, then concern. "Foreclosing? No, I had no idea," he frowned, taking a step closer. "When did you learn this?" "Yesterday, after your visit." Hannah watched his face carefully. "A banker from Denver rode out with the sheriff. They're calling in my husband's loan, $842 due in 30 days. Jackson let out a low whistle. "That's a substantial sum." "An impossible sum," Hannah corrected him. "Not without selling everything, and even then, it wouldn't be enough in this market." Understanding dawned in Jackson's eyes. "And you thought I knew about this? That my offer of partnership was a calculated attempt to acquire my land cheaply? The thought crossed my mind." Hannah's directness seemed to surprise him, but she pressed on. "You wouldn't be the first to try such a tactic. There have been plenty of offers since William died, all from men who saw a widow as easy prey." Instead of taking offense, Jackson nodded slowly. "I can't blame you for the suspicion." "In your position, I'd likely think the same," he He gestured toward the house. Would you care to sit in the shade for a spell? It's getting warm out here, and this conversation deserves more consideration than we can give it standing in the sun. Hannah hesitated, then nodded. Lead the way. The interior of the Pearson house was cooler, though sparsely furnished. Jackson offered her a chair at a simple wooden table and poured 2 glasses of water from a clay pitcher. I meant what I said about putting down roots, he said, sitting across from her. I've spent 15 years driving other men's cattle, sleeping under other men's roofs when I was lucky enough to have a roof at all. I've saved every penny I could, looking toward the day I'd have my own place. He took a sip of water. The partnership I proposed wasn't about taking advantage of you, Hannah. It was a genuine offer based on what I believed was mutual benefit. And now that you know about the foreclosure, Hannah asked, studying him over the rim of her glass. Jackson didn't answer immediately, his blue eyes thoughtful. Now we're facing a different situation entirely, he finally said, one that requires more immediate action, meaning I might be able to help with the loan. He held up a hand as Hannah stiffened, not as charity. As an investment in our potential partnership. Hannah set her glass down carefully. I won't sell my land, even a portion of it. I'm not asking you to sell, Jackson replied. I'm suggesting a formal business partnership. I provide the capital to satisfy the bank, and in return, we combine our operations. Equal partners in everything your ranch and mine, operated as a single entity. Shared profits, shared decisions, shared work. The proposal was both more and less than Hannah had expected. That's a serious commitment from someone who's known me less than 2 days. A smile tugged at the corner of Jackson's mouth. I'm a good judge of character, Hannah Green. Had to be in my line of work. A man who can't read people truly doesn't last long on the trail. His expression grew more serious. Besides, I've been asking about you in town. Everything I've heard confirms what I suspected when I met you. You're honest, hardworking, and know ranching better than most men in the territory. Hannah wasn't sure whether to be flattered or unsettled that he'd been making inquiries about her. And what would this partnership look like in practice? Would you expect to move onto my land? No, Jackson said firmly. Each of us maintains our separate households. We would need to hire hands to help with the expanded operation, of course, but the arrangement would be purely business. He paused. Unless, at some point in the future, both parties wished otherwise. The implication hung in the air between them. Hannah felt a flush rise to her cheeks but refused to look away. You're very direct, Mr. Garner. Life's too short for anything else, he replied simply. I've watched good men die because they hesitated when directness was called for. I don't aim to make that mistake. Hannah found herself respecting his honesty, even as she remained cautious about his proposal. I'll need time to consider this, she said. It's not a decision to be made lightly. Of course, Jackson agreed. But the bank has given you 30 days, which means we don't have the luxury of an extended deliberation. I'd need to ride to Denver to withdraw the funds, which is at least a 3-day journey each way. You have that much money available. Hannah couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Jackson's expression was steady. I've been saving for 15 years, Hannah, living simply, investing carefully. Yes, I can cover the loan, though it would take most of what I have set aside for expanding this place. He leaned forward slightly. But I believe the combined operation would be worth far more than either of our ranches alone. Hannah stood, needing to move to think. She walked to the window and looked out at the newly repaired corral, the healthy horses inside it, the cleared field beyond. There was vision here, the beginnings of something substantial. I need 2 days, she said, turning back to face him. 2 days to go over my accounts, to consider all aspects of this proposal. Jackson nodded, rising as well. 2 days is reasonable. Shall I call on you the day after tomorrow, then? Yes, Hannah said, a decision forming in her mind, but not at the house. Meet me at the south pasture by the old oak that marks the boundary of my property. Midday would be best. I'll be there, Jackson promised. He walked her to the door, where Copper waited patiently in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "And Hannah, regardless of what you decide, I meant what I said about admiring how you've managed on your own. That respect won't change, whatever comes of this conversation." As Jackson helped her mount, their hands brushed briefly, sending that same unexpected warmth through her that she'd felt when he'd handed her the coffee cup. Hannah settled herself in the saddle, adjusting her skirt with more attention than was strictly necessary. "Thank you for hearing me out," she said formally. "And for your candor. Safe journey home," Jackson replied, stepping back as she turned Copper toward the trail. As Hannah rode away, she found herself more conflicted than when she'd arrived. Jackson Garner seemed genuine, his offer potentially the answer to her desperate situation. Yet years of hard-won caution made her hesitant to place such trust in a man she barely knew, no matter how forthright he appeared or how practical his proposal. By the time she reached her own ranch, the sun was high overhead, and her mind was no closer to a resolution. 2 days to decide the future of everything she'd worked for. 2 days to determine whether Jackson Garner was the salvation of her dreams or just another disappointment waiting to happen. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of activity as Hannah took stock of her situation with ruthless honesty. She reviewed her accounts, assessed her livestock, and calculated the potential value of a combined operation with the Pearson Ranch. The numbers were promising. Jackson's water resources complemented her better grazing land. His focus on horses aligned well with her own experience, and the economies of scale could significantly reduce their individual costs. Yet beyond the practical considerations lay more personal concerns. A partnership of this nature required implicit trust, a commodity Hannah had found in short supply since William's death. More unsettling were the unbidden thoughts of Jackson himself that kept intruding on her calculations: the warmth of his smile, the steadiness of his gaze, the capable hands that had so obviously transformed the neglected Pearson place in a matter of weeks. On the morning of their appointed meeting, Hannah rose early and dressed with particular care, choosing a blue riding skirt that William had once said matched her eyes. She told herself it was simply appropriate to look presentable for a business discussion, but the extra moments spent pinning her hair and the dab of rosewater at her wrists suggested otherwise. By midday, she was waiting at the old oak tree, a massive sentinel that had witnessed the passage of generations long before settlers had claimed this land. From this vantage point, both ranches were visible, her own property stretching westward toward town, the Pearson place rising into the eastern foothills. The boundary between them seemed arbitrary from here, a human designation imposed on land that had no natural divisions. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. Jackson appeared over the rise, the sun at his back casting his figure in sharp relief against the sky. He rode with the easy confidence she'd noted during their first meeting, and had dressed more formally than she'd yet seen him, a clean white shirt under a dark vest, his usual trail-worn hat replaced with a newer one. "Afternoon, Hannah," he called as he approached, raising a hand in greeting. "Beautiful day." Indeed, it was one of those perfect Colorado days when the sky seemed impossibly blue and the air carried the scent of sage and distant pine. Hannah returned his greeting with a nod, suddenly finding herself uncharacteristically nervous. Jackson dismounted and secured his horse beside her mare. When he turned to face her, his expression was serious but open. "Have you reached a decision?" he asked, coming straight to the point as was his way. Hannah appreciated his directness. "I've considered your proposal carefully," she began, meeting his gaze. "The business arrangement makes sense on paper. Our properties complement each other, and together we'd stand a better chance than either of us would alone." "But," Jackson prompted, hearing the reservation in her voice. "But such a partnership requires tremendous trust," Hannah continued. "Trust that takes time to build, and time is the one thing I don't have right now." Jackson nodded slowly. That's understandable. What would help you feel more secure in this arrangement? Hannah had anticipated this question and had prepared her answer. Legal protections. A contract drawn up by a lawyer, not Wilson's man in town, but someone independent, perhaps from Denver. Something that clearly outlines our respective contributions and rights, with provisions for dissolving the partnership if necessary. That's entirely reasonable, Jackson agreed without hesitation. I would expect nothing less. In fact, I took the liberty of drafting some preliminary terms. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document. Not legally binding yet, of course, but a starting point for discussion. Hannah accepted the paper, impressed by his foresight. As she scanned the document, she found the terms fair and straightforward, exactly as he described in their previous conversation. Equal partnership, combined operations, shared profits, with clear provisions for either party to buy out the other's interest under specific circumstances. You've given this considerable thought, she observed, refolding the paper. I have. Jackson's gaze was steady. Hannah, I won't pretend this is solely a business decision for me. I admire your strength, your determination. Working alongside you would be, well, it would be a privilege. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, Hannah found herself at a loss for words, unaccustomed to such direct admiration from a man who seemed to value her as an equal. Thank you, she said finally, her voice softer than she'd intended. She cleared her throat and continued more firmly. If we proceed with this, I want it understood that my ranch remains mine. The partnership applies to operations, not ownership of the land itself. Agreed, Jackson said promptly. The same applies to my property. We maintain separate ownership of our lands while sharing the business of ranching them. Hannah nodded, relief washing through her. This was the crux of her concern, that somehow, despite his assurances, she might lose control of the ranch she'd fought so hard to keep. Then I accept your proposal, she said, extending her hand in a businesslike gesture. Partners. Jackson took her hand, his grip warm and firm. Partners, he echoed, a smile breaking across his features. I believe we've just made a decision that will benefit us both for years to come. As their hands remained joined a moment longer than strictly necessary, Hannah felt something shift between them, something that transcended the practical arrangement they just agreed upon. When Jackson finally released her hand, the absence of his touch left her strangely bereft. I'll ride to Denver tomorrow, he said, his voice taking on a more practical tone. Should take about a week for the round trip, including time to meet with the bank and have proper papers drawn up by a reputable lawyer. A week, Hannah repeated, mentally calculating the remaining days before the bank's deadline. That should leave us enough time, assuming no complications. I'll make sure there are none, Jackson assured her with a confidence that Hannah found both reassuring and attractive. They spent the next hour discussing practical matters, which lawyer to engage, how to structure the formal agreement, what immediate steps to take once the loan was paid. Throughout the conversation, Hannah found herself increasingly comfortable with Jackson's approach to their partnership. He listened to her input respectfully, offered suggestions without imposing them, and demonstrated a clear understanding of the challenges they faced. As the sun began its westward descent, they mounted their horses to return to their respective ranches. I'll stop by your place before dawn tomorrow, Jackson said as they prepared to part ways. If there's any correspondence you'd like me to deliver in Denver, or any specific provisions you want included in the legal documents, have them ready. I will, Hannah promised. She hesitated, then added, Be careful on the trail, Jackson. The road to Denver can be dangerous this time of year. Flash floods in the canyons, not to mention the occasional bandit. His expression softened at her concern. I've made the journey many times, but I appreciate your warning. He tipped his hat to her. Until tomorrow, partner. As Hannah watched him ride away, she was struck by the strange mixture of emotions swirling within her relief at having found a solution to her financial crisis. anxiety about the significant step she'd just taken, and an unexpected warmth whenever she thought of Jackson Garner calling her partner in that deep, steady voice of his. The practical side of her insisted this was merely a business arrangement, a necessary measure to save her ranch. But another part, a part she'd thought long dormant since William's death, recognized that something more was taking root. As surely as the wildflowers Jackson had brought to her door were now thriving in a jar on her kitchen windowsill. True to his word, Jackson appeared at Hannah's gate before first light the next morning, his horse loaded with provisions for the journey to Denver. Hannah was waiting for him on the porch, a lamp burning in the pre-dawn darkness, a small packet of papers in her hand. "You're prompt," she observed as he dismounted and approached the steps. "Always have been," he replied. "My father used to say tardiness was just another form of dishonesty, a way of telling folks their time wasn't as valuable as yours." Hannah nodded, appreciating the sentiment. She'd always valued punctuality herself, a trait not universally shared on the frontier where timepieces were scarce and appointments often approximate. "These are my notes for the lawyer," she said, handing him the packet. "Nothing extensive, just clarifications on a few points regarding water rights and boundary markers, and a letter of authorization for you to act on my behalf with the bank." Jackson accepted the papers carefully. "I'll make sure they're incorporated into the agreement." He tucked them securely inside his coat. "I should reach Denver by nightfall day after tomorrow, barring any unforeseen delays." "And you have sufficient funds for the journey?" Hannah asked. "I can contribute, I'm well provisioned," Jackson assured her. "Save your resources. We'll need them for hiring hands once I return and we begin expanding operations." The way he spoke of their future plans with quiet confidence, and without a hint of condescension, reinforced Hannah's growing belief that she'd made the right decision. Still, as the moment of his departure approached, she found herself unexpectedly reluctant to see him go. "I've prepared something for your journey," she said, turning to retrieve a wrapped package from the small table beside the door. "Nothing elaborate, just some bread, cheese, and dried venison. The road between here and Castle Rock has few reliable stopping places." Jackson accepted the package with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Thank you, that's thoughtful of you." He hesitated, then added, "It's been a long while since anyone cared enough to pack provisions for me." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, but as a matter of fact, reminded Hannah that for all his capability and confidence, Jackson had been as alone in the world as she had. The realization created a sense of kinship that transcended their business arrangement. "Safe journey, Jackson," she said softly. "I'll be expecting your return in a week's time." He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, something unspoken passing between them. "I'll be back before you know it," he promised. Then, with a final tip of his hat, he returned to his horse and mounted up. Hannah watched until he disappeared into the gradually lightening eastern horizon, the rising sun eventually erasing his silhouette from view. Only then did she turn back to the house, already mentally preparing the list of tasks to complete before his return. The days that followed were filled with practical preparations. Hannah inspected fences that would need repair, calculated feed requirements for a combined herd, and identified areas where additional hands would be most needed. Each evening, she updated her account books, creating a comprehensive inventory of her assets to share with Jackson upon his return. Yet despite the business-like nature of her activities, Hannah found her thoughts repeatedly straying to Jackson himself. She wondered about his progress on the journey, whether he'd encountered any difficulties, what he might be thinking as he rode the long miles to Denver. More than once, she caught herself glancing eastward, as if she might somehow discern his distant figure on the horizon. On the fourth day after his departure, a violent thunderstorm swept through the valley, bringing much-needed rain, but also flooding the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of her property. Hannah spent hours redirecting the overflow to protect her fields, working well past dark in sodden clothes and mud-caked boots. As she finally returned to the house, exhausted and chilled, her thoughts turned to Jackson with renewed concern. If the storm had reached the mountain passes between Cottonwood Springs and Denver, travel would be treacherous at best, deadly at worst. It was in just such conditions that William had lost his life, swept away by waters that had appeared without warning in a previously dry canyon. Sleep eluded her that night, her mind filled with images of raging torrents and a lone rider struggling against the elements. By morning, though the storm had passed, leaving behind a freshly washed landscape and clearing skies, Hannah's anxiety remained. The following days crept by with agonizing slowness. Hannah threw herself into work, taking on tasks she'd long postponed, mending tack in the barn, reorganizing the root cellar, even whitewashing the kitchen walls. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from dwelling on increasingly worrisome scenarios. When the 7th day arrived with no sign of Jackson's return, Hannah told herself there was no cause for alarm. Travel times were always approximate, subject to conditions and unforeseen delays. He'd said about a week, not precisely 7 days. By the 9th day, however, her concern had deepened into genuine worry. The rational part of her mind suggested dozens of innocent explanations for his delayed return business in Denver taking longer than anticipated, the need for additional legal consultations, roads made impassable by the recent storms. Yet another part of her, the part that had lived with loss and disappointment, whispered darker possibilities. Perhaps Jackson had never intended to return. Perhaps the partnership had been an elaborate ruse to gain her trust, her signature on the authorization letter providing him access to what little remained of her assets. On the morning of the 10th day, Hannah could bear the uncertainty no longer. She saddled Copper and rode into town, determined to send a telegram to the Denver bank inquiring about Jackson's business there. If he had betrayed her, she needed to know immediately. If he had encountered difficulties, she might be able to help. Cottonwood Springs was barely more than a wide spot in the trail, a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings that included a general store, a saloon, the sheriff's office, the small bank where Harlan Wilson presided, and thankfully, a telegraph office. Hannah tied Copper at the hitching rail outside Wilson's mercantile and banking company, steeling herself for an encounter she'd been avoiding since the Denver banker's visit. The interior was cool and dim after the brightness outside. Harlan Wilson looked up from his ledger as the bell above the door announced her entrance, his pinched features registering surprise. "Mrs. Green," he said, setting down his pen. "This is unexpected, Mr. Wilson," Hannah acknowledged with a curt nod. "I'm here to send a telegram to Denver regarding my loan." Wilson's eyebrows rose. "I'm afraid that matter is out of my hands now, Mrs. Green. As Mr. Bradford explained." "I'm well aware of what Mr. Bradford explained," Hannah interrupted. "I'm not here to dispute the terms. I'm inquiring about a business associate who traveled to Denver last week to address the matter on my behalf." Interest and something that looked suspiciously like concern flickered across Wilson's face. "A business associate. I wasn't aware you had entered into any new arrangements, Mrs. Green." Hannah had no intention of sharing the details of her partnership with Wilson, who had never disguised his belief that a woman had no business running a ranch. "Mr. Jackson Garner," she said simply. "He left for Denver 9 days ago and has not yet returned. I wish to confirm whether he completed his business with the bank there." Recognition dawned in Wilson's eyes. "The fellow who bought the Pearson place, tall man, speaks with a slight Texas drawl." Hannah nodded, a flicker of hope rising at Wilson's apparent familiarity with Jackson. "You know him?" "Met him briefly when he first arrived in town," Wilson confirmed. "Seemed a decent sort. Made inquiries about available properties, settled on the Pearson place even though there were better options." He leaned forward slightly. If you don't mind my asking, Mrs. Green, what sort of business arrangement have you entered into with Mr. Garner? I do mind your asking, Hannah replied firmly. Now, about that telegram, the door behind her opened, the bell jangling as Sheriff Mercer entered, removing his hat as he spotted Hannah. Mrs. Green, he greeted her. I was just coming to see you, saved me the ride out to your place. Something in his tone sent a chill through Hannah. What is it, Sheriff? Mercer exchanged a glance with Wilson before answering. There was an incident on the Denver road 3 days back. Stage driver reported a rider down in Peterson's Canyon, about 30 miles east of here. Horse was gone, but they found some personal effects. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. This had your name on it. With suddenly unsteady hands, Hannah accepted the paper, recognizing it immediately as one of the documents she'd given Jackson for the lawyer. It was water-stained and crumpled, but her handwriting was still clearly visible. Was there, her voice caught, and she had to start again. Did they find him? Mercer shook his head. Canyon was flooded pretty bad after that storm if he was caught in it. He left the implication hanging. Stage couldn't stop long, they had passengers and the mail. Driver said he'd alert the authorities in Castle Rock to send someone back to search, but with the water still high. Again, he didn't finish the sentence. Hannah stared at the paper in her hand, her mind refusing to process what the sheriff was telling her. This couldn't be happening, not again. Not the same cruel fate that had taken William, now claiming the man who had offered her hope when she needed it most. Mrs. Green. Wilson's voice seemed to come from a great distance. Are you all right? Hannah straightened her shoulders with effort. I'm fine, she said automatically, though she was anything but. Sheriff, where exactly in Peterson's Canyon was this found? Mercer frowned. About a mile past the narrow bend where the wall's close in. Dangerous spot when it rains. Water can rise 20 feet in minutes. Hannah knew the location. She and William had traveled that road many times in the early years. I see. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. Mrs. Green, Mercer said, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it, I wouldn't get my hopes up. That canyon's claimed more than its share of lives over the years. Nevertheless, Hannah replied, carefully refolding the paper and placing it in her pocket. I would appreciate it if you would let me know immediately if you receive any further information. Both men nodded, watching her with expressions that mingled pity with concern. Hannah hated those looks, had seen too many of them after William's death. She nodded curtly to both and turned to leave, her back straight and her head high despite the turmoil within. Outside, she untied Copper with mechanical movements, her mind racing. If Jackson had been caught in the flash flood, the chances of survival were slim. Yet people had survived such things before. William's body had been found. There was no confirmation that Jackson had perished. A wild, desperate plan began to form in her mind. Castle Rock was less than a day's hard ride. From there, she could organize a proper search of the canyon. If Jackson was injured but alive, every hour might matter. Decision made, Hannah mounted Copper and turned him not toward home but east, toward the road to Denver. She would need supplies for the journey, but there was no time to waste returning to the ranch. The general store would have what she needed. Within an hour, she had purchased provisions, a bedroll, and ammunition for the rifle she carried in her saddle scabbard. The storekeeper, Jim Holloway, had watched her selections with growing concern. Planning a trip, Mrs. Green? He'd asked as he wrapped the salt pork and hardtack she'd selected. Yes, Hannah had replied simply, offering no further explanation. Now, as she urged Copper into a steady trot eastward, leaving Cottonwood Springs behind, Hannah felt a curious sense of calm replace the initial shock and panic. She had a purpose, a direction. Whatever she found, whether Jackson alive, injured but surviving, dead, another victim of the unforgiving land, or gone without a trace, leaving her to wonder forever, she would face it directly, as she had faced every other challenge since coming west. The road stretched before her, climbing gradually toward the distant foothills where Peterson's Canyon cut a narrow path through the ancient rock. Somewhere ahead lay answers, and Hannah Green was determined to find them, whatever the cost. The journey to Peterson's Canyon was grueling. Hannah pushed herself and Copper hard, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest the horse and take minimal sustenance herself. By nightfall, she had covered nearly 20 miles of increasingly difficult terrain, the flat prairie giving way to rolling hills, and eventually the rocky approaches to the canyon itself. Making camp alone in the wilderness was nothing new to Hannah. She'd done it many times with William, and occasionally on her own when ranch business required it. But tonight, as she built a small fire and spread her bedroll beneath a stunted pine, every sound of the night seemed magnified: the lonely cry of a coyote in the distance, the rustle of wind through the scrub oak, the occasional snap of cooling embers from her fire. Sleep came fitfully, her dreams filled with rushing water and reaching hands that slipped from her grasp. She woke before dawn, stiff and unrested, but determined to press on as soon as there was enough light to safely navigate the trail. By mid-morning, she reached the eastern entrance to Peterson's Canyon, where the road narrowed dramatically between towering walls of striated red rock. Evidence of the recent flooding was everywhere: debris lodged high on the canyon walls, uprooted trees deposited in impossible locations, sections of the trail completely washed away, forcing her to dismount and lead Copper carefully around treacherous washouts. According to Sheriff Mercer, Jackson's belongings had been found about a mile past the narrow bend. Hannah proceeded cautiously, her eyes scanning the canyon floor and walls for any sign of human presence. The devastation was sobering: nature's power laid bare in the twisted wreckage of trees and boulders moved like toys by the flood waters. When she reached the approximate location described by the sheriff, Hannah tethered Copper to a sturdy juniper and began a systematic search of the area on foot. The task seemed nearly impossible. The canyon stretched for miles, with countless crevices, overhangs, and debris piles where a man or his belongings might be hidden. Yet Hannah refused to be deterred. Methodically, she worked her way along the canyon floor, then climbed to examine higher ledges where someone might have scrambled to escape the rising water. Hours passed, the sun climbing to its zenith and then beginning its descent, casting lengthening shadows that complicated her search. It was late afternoon when she spotted a flash of something unnatural among a tangle of flood debris wedged against the canyon wall. Drawing closer, Hannah's heart leaped as she recognized Jackson's saddlebag, half buried in silt and broken branches. With renewed energy, she scrambled over the debris, heedless of the scratches from broken wood and the mud that caked her skirts. The saddlebag was torn and water-damaged, but unmistakably, the tooled leather pattern she'd noticed during his visit to her ranch still visible despite the abuse it had suffered. Hannah's hands trembled as she worked it free from the debris. Inside, she found more of the papers she'd given him, now sodden and mostly illegible, along with a small leather pouch containing gold coins, his traveling money, apparently untouched. This discovery confirmed her worst fears. Jackson had indeed been caught in the flood, and he wouldn't have abandoned his funds if he'd been able to continue his journey. Yet there was still no sign of the man himself. Hannah stood, clutching the recovered saddlebag, and surveyed the canyon with renewed determination. If the bag had been deposited here by the receding waters, Jackson himself couldn't be far, whether alive or... She refused to complete the thought, focusing instead on expanding her search. The canyon widened slightly beyond this point, with several small tributary ravines joining the main passage. Any of these might have provided shelter or become a death trap as waters rose. The light was failing rapidly now, the canyon walls blocking the late afternoon sun. Hannah knew she should make camp for the night, but the thought of stopping, of delaying her search even for necessary rest, was unbearable. Jackson had already been missing for days. If he was injured, every hour could mean the difference between life and death. She was about to reluctantly return to where she'd left Copper when a sound caught her attention, so faint she might have imagined it. Hannah froze, straining to hear above the whisper of the wind through the canyon. There it was again, a scraping sound, like stone against stone, followed by what might have been a human voice. "Hello," Hannah called, her own voice echoing strangely off the canyon walls. "Is someone there?" Silence answered her, then another faint sound, definitely a voice this time, though the words were indistinguishable. Hannah scrambled toward the source, climbing over a massive tangle of flood debris toward a narrow side ravine she hadn't yet explored. "Jackson." She called, hope and fear warring in her chest. "Jackson Garner, here." The reply was weak but unmistakable. "Over here." Following the voice, Hannah pushed through a dense thicket of broken branches into the ravine. There, wedged into a narrow crevice about 10 feet up the ravine wall, was Jackson. Even in the failing light, Hannah could see he was in bad shape. His clothes were torn and caked with dried mud, his face was gaunt with dehydration, and his right leg was extended at an unnatural angle that suggested serious injury. But he was alive wonderfully, miraculously alive. "Hannah," his voice was a rasp, disbelief evident in his tone. "Is that really you, or have I finally lost my mind completely?" "It's me," she confirmed, already searching for the best way to reach him. "Don't move, I'm coming up." The climb was treacherous, the rock face still slick from the flood and crumbling in places. Hannah tested each handhold carefully, aware that a fall would help neither of them. When she finally reached the crevice where Jackson had taken refuge, she found it was actually a shallow cave, its entrance partially obscured by the angle of the ravine wall, easy to miss, unless you knew exactly where to look. Jackson was propped against the back wall, his injured legs stretched before him. Makeshift splints fashioned from broken branches tied to either side with strips torn from his shirt. His face, normally tanned from outdoor work, was pale beneath several days' growth of beard, and a nasty gash across his forehead had crusted over with dried blood. "You found me," he said, wonder in his voice. "How did you?" "Sheriff Mercer brought me one of my papers," Hannah explained, kneeling beside him and reaching for her canteen. "The stage driver spotted some of your things. When you didn't return after 9 days, I knew something was wrong." She held the canteen to his lips, and he drank gratefully, though she allowed him only small sips at first. "Easy," she cautioned. "Too much at once will make you sick." Jackson nodded, closing his eyes briefly as the water, the first he'd had in who knew how long, revived him slightly. "My horse bolted when the water hit us," he said, his voice slightly stronger. "I managed to grab onto a tree as the flood swept me downstream. When the waters receded, I found myself stranded here with a broken leg and no supplies." Hannah examined the splint he'd fashioned. The work was crude but effective, the leg immobilized between the branches. "Clean break?" she asked. Jackson grimaced. "I think so. Hurt like the devil when I set it, but the pain's been manageable since. It's the thirst that nearly finished me off." He looked at her with genuine amazement. "I can't believe you came looking for me, riding into this canyon alone." "What did you expect me to do?" Hannah asked, busying herself with checking his other injuries to hide the emotion in her voice. "You're my partner." The simple declaration hung between them, weighted with everything neither of them was yet ready to say. "Some partner," Jackson said with a weak attempt at humor. "Can't even make it to Denver and back without creating a problem for you to solve." Hannah met his gaze directly. "You would have done the same for me." It wasn't a question, but Jackson answered anyway, in a heartbeat. The certainty in his voice, despite his weakened condition, touched something deep within Hannah. This man, who'd known her so briefly, had already shown more faith in her capabilities and more concern for her welfare than many who'd known her for years. "We need to get you down from here," she said, reverting to practicality. "Night's coming on fast and we'll need shelter. Can you move at all?" Jackson tested his good leg cautiously. With help, maybe, but that climb down. Hannah assessed the situation. The descent would be treacherous even for someone uninjured. For Jackson, with a broken leg and weakened by days without food or water, it could be deadly. "We'll stay here tonight," she decided. "I'll go back for my supplies and copper. At first light, we'll figure out how to get you safely down." Jackson nodded, clearly relieved not to attempt the descent in failing light. "The cave stays dry, even during rain," he offered. "Found that out the hard way when another storm passed through yesterday." Hannah squeezed his hand briefly. "I'll be back as quickly as I can. Keep talking or singing or something so I can find my way back in the dark." "Not sure you want to hear my singing," Jackson replied with a ghost of his usual smile. "But I'll keep calling out." The journey back to Copper and her supplies seemed interminable, though in reality it couldn't have been more than 30 minutes. By the time Hannah returned to the cave, night had fallen completely, and only Jackson's periodic calls and the small lantern she'd brought from her saddlebags guided her back to him. In the lantern light, she could see his condition more clearly. He was dangerously dehydrated, his lips cracked and his skin drawn tight over his cheekbones. The wound on his forehead, while not actively bleeding, showed signs of infection, the skin around it red and slightly swollen. "First things first," Hannah said, opening her pack and withdrawing a clean cloth and her medical supplies. "Let's get that head wound cleaned up." Jackson submitted to her ministrations without protest, wincing only slightly as she cleaned the gash with water and a small amount of whiskey from her flask. As she worked, she kept up a steady stream of conversation, partly to distract him from the pain and partly to keep her own rising emotions in check. "The whole town's talking about your disappearance," she told him, applying a salve to the wound before bandaging it carefully. "Sheriff Mercer seemed certain you'd been swept away completely, and Harlan Wilson was suspiciously interested in our business arrangements." "Wilson," Jackson muttered, his expression darkening. "That man's been trying to consolidate control of the valley for years." "Heard about it from Pearson's son when I bought the place." Hannah nodded. "He's always had an eye on my water rights. After William died, he tried to convince me the deed wasn't properly filed and offered to help me secure it for a significant portion of the land, of course." "Let me guess," Jackson said, accepting a small piece of jerky she offered him. "He's tight with whoever bought your husband's loan from the Denver bank." "Wouldn't surprise me in the least," Hannah agreed, spreading her bedroll beside him in the confined space of the cave. "But that's a problem for another day. Right now, we need to focus on getting you out of here and somewhere your leg can properly heal." As she settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched in the narrow space, Hannah was acutely aware of the intimacy of their situation. Propriety would dictate maintaining a more respectable distance, but practicality, and if she was honest with herself, a desire to share her warmth with his chilled body overrode such concerns. "Thank you," Jackson said quietly as she extinguished the lantern to conserve oil. "For finding me. For not giving up." In the darkness, Hannah felt his hand seek hers, his fingers cool but his grip surprisingly strong given his condition. She returned the pressure, allowing herself to acknowledge how desperately she'd feared finding him dead or worse, never finding him at all, left to wonder forever what had become of the man who'd offered her hope when she needed it most. "Sleep," she said softly. "Tomorrow will be challenging enough without adding exhaustion to our problems." But long after Jackson's breathing had deepened into the rhythm of sleep, his hand still clasped in hers, Hannah remained awake, listening to the night sounds of the canyon and contemplating the strange twist of fate that had brought them to this moment. She had ridden out seeking answers, prepared for the worst. Instead, she had found not just Jackson alive, but also something she hadn't realized. She was missing a connection that went beyond their business arrangement, beyond the practical partnership they'd agreed upon. Something that felt dangerously like the beginning of affection, of trust restored, of a heart long closed beginning to open once more. As sleep finally claimed her, Hannah's last conscious thought was a simple prayer of gratitude that she would not have to face another dawn alone. Morning arrived with a palette of gold and rose painting the eastern sky. Hannah woke first, momentarily disoriented until the events of the previous day rushed back. Jackson slept beside her, his face relaxed in slumber despite the obvious discomfort of his position. Even with several days' growth of beard and the bandage on his forehead, there was something compelling about his features' strength tempered by kindness, resilience marked by the lines around his eyes and mouth. Hannah allowed herself a moment to simply look at him, to acknowledge the flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with their precarious situation and everything to do with the man himself. Then, with practiced efficiency, she set about preparing for the difficult task ahead. Their most pressing challenge was getting Jackson safely down from the cave and then out of the canyon. Hannah slipped out quietly to check on Copper and scout the best route. In daylight, she could see that the ravine below the cave was littered with debris but relatively accessible if they were careful. When she returned, Jackson was awake, attempting to sit up straighter despite obvious pain. "How bad is it?" he asked without preamble, nodding toward his injured leg. Hannah appreciated his directness. "The break seems clean and your splint is holding, but we need to get you to a doctor as soon as possible. That journey won't be pleasant." Jackson nodded grimly. "I figured as much. What's your plan?" "First, getting you down from here," Hannah said, unpacking the rope she'd brought from her supplies. "Then back to Copper. I can fashion a travois to drag behind him, make you as comfortable as possible for the ride to Castle Rock. There's a decent doctor there who's treated similar injuries." "And the ranch, the loan payment?" Jackson asked, concern evident in his voice despite his condition. "One problem at a time," Hannah replied firmly. "First, we get you medical attention, then we can worry about the rest." The descent from the cave proved every bit as challenging as Hannah had anticipated. Using her rope and considerable ingenuity, she managed to create a system that allowed Jackson to be lowered with minimal jostling of his injured leg. Still, by the time they reached the canyon floor, his face was gray with pain, and sweat beaded his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Rest a moment," Hannah instructed, offering her canteen. "We're in no rush now that we're down." Jackson drank gratefully, then leaned back against a boulder, closing his eyes briefly. "You'd have made a fine trail boss," he said, a hint of his usual humor returning despite his obvious discomfort. "Efficient, resourceful, and not taking no for an answer." Hannah smiled despite herself. "High praise from a man who's driven cattle across half the Western Territories." "Highest praise," Jackson corrected, meeting her gaze with unexpected intensity. "Hannah, what you've done, coming after me like this, alone. It's more than I had any right to expect from anyone, let alone someone who's known me barely 2 weeks." Hannah busied herself checking the makeshift splint, uncomfortable with the emotion his words stirred in her. "Yes, well, as I said, we're partners now. Partners look out for each other." "Is that all it is?" Jackson asked quietly. "A business obligation," Hannah's hands stilled on the splint. She could deflect the question, maintain the careful distance she'd kept between herself and others since William's death. It would be the safe choice, the prudent choice. Instead, she found herself answering with an honesty that surprised even her. "No," she admitted, finally meeting his eyes. "That's not all it is." The smile that spread across Jackson's face, then warm and genuine despite his pain and exhaustion, made something unfurl in Hannah's chest, a sensation both terrifying and exhilarating. "Good," he said simply, "because it's not just business for me either, not anymore." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and unspoken promises. Then, with reluctant practicality, Hannah broke the spell. "We should get moving while the day is still cool," she said, rising to her feet. "I'll bring Copper as close as I can, then help you to him." The next hour was consumed with the laborious process of getting Jackson mounted on Copper, his injured leg secured as comfortably as possible. Hannah had decided against a travois, realizing the rough canyon floor would make such transport more painful than riding double, with Jackson behind her and his injured leg extended to one side. By mid-morning, they were making slow but steady progress out of the canyon, Hannah carefully guiding Copper around the worst of the debris. Jackson's arms were wrapped around her waist for stability, his chest pressed against her back. The physical proximity was unfamiliar after years of maintaining careful distance from others, but not unwelcome. "You holding up all right?" Hannah asked over her shoulder as they navigated a particularly rough stretch. "I've been better," Jackson admitted, his voice tight with pain. "But I've been worse too. At least I'm not alone in a cave waiting to die of thirst." The blunt assessment sent a chill through Hannah despite the warming day. How close she had come to never finding him, to losing this chance at whatever this was becoming between them. "You're not alone now," she said quietly, one hand briefly covering his where it rested at her waist. "And I intend to keep it that way." They reached Castle Rock just as dusk was falling, Copper stumbling with exhaustion after the long, difficult journey. The small town, larger than Cottonwood Springs, but still modest by Eastern standards, was mostly quiet, though lights burned in the saloon and at the doctor's residence at the end of the main street. Dr. Andrew Morrow was a gruff, elderly man who'd served as an army surgeon during the war before settling in the Colorado Territory. He took one look at Jackson's condition and ushered them inside without preamble. "Broken tibia," he pronounced after examining the leg. "Clean break, fortunately, and you did a decent job setting it." He glanced at Hannah. "Your work," Hannah corrected, nodding toward Jackson. "He did it himself after the flood." Morrow's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "Impressive. Most men would have passed out from the pain." "Nearly did," Jackson admitted with a weak smile, "but the alternative seemed worse." "Indeed." The doctor turned to Hannah. "He'll need the leg properly set and splinted, then bed rest for at least 2 weeks before even considering travel back to Cottonwood Springs. Even then, he won't be putting weight on it for 6 weeks minimum." Hannah nodded, already calculating the implications. "Is there a hotel in town where we can stay?" "The Wayfarer's Inn, 2 doors down," Morrow replied. "Nothing fancy, but clean enough." "Tell Mabel I sent you, she'll give you a fair rate." He turned back to Jackson. "Now, this next part won't be pleasant. I'll need to re-break the bone to set it properly." Jackson's face paled slightly, but he nodded. "Do what you have to do, Doc." Hannah moved to leave, assuming the doctor would prefer privacy for the procedure, but Jackson caught her hand. "Stay?" he asked, vulnerability momentarily visible beneath his usual stoicism. "If you don't mind." She hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course." What followed was among the most difficult experiences of Hannah's life, watching as Jackson endured excruciating pain while Dr. Morrow manipulated the broken bone. His jaw clenched so tightly she feared his teeth might crack, his hand gripping hers with almost brutal force. Not once did he cry out, though sweat poured down his face and his complexion went from pale to ashen. When it was finally over, Jackson lay back on the examination table, exhausted beyond words, his newly splinted leg propped on folded blankets. "Doctor." Morrow administered a dose of laudanum for the pain, and within minutes, Jackson's features relaxed as the medicine took effect. "He's strong," Morrow observed as he washed his hands in a basin. "And lucky. Many don't survive flash floods in those canyons. Will there be permanent damage?" Hannah asked, still seated beside Jackson, her hand now resting lightly on his arm. "Hard to say for certain," the doctor replied honestly. "The bone should heal well enough if he follows instructions and gives it proper time. There might be some lingering pain in cold weather, perhaps a slight limp, but he should regain full function eventually." Relief washed through Hannah. A permanent disability would have been devastating for a man like Jackson, whose livelihood depended on physical capability. "I'll arrange rooms at the inn," she said, reluctantly withdrawing her hand from Jackson's arm. "Then come back with help to move him." Morrow nodded approvingly. "Good plan. He'll sleep for several hours with that dose of laudanum. When he wakes, the pain will be significant but manageable." The Wayfarers' Inn proved to be a modest two-story building with clean, simple rooms. Mabel, the proprietress, was a cheerful widow who clucked sympathetically when Hannah explained the situation. "Poor man," she said, assigning adjacent rooms at the end of the hall where it would be quietest. "Flash floods are a terrible thing. Lost my own brother to one back in '68. She eyed Hannah speculatively. "You and Mr. Garner are." "Business partners," Hannah replied automatically, then found herself adding, "and friends." Mabel's knowing smile suggested she drew her own conclusions, but she made no further comment beyond offering to send up hot water for washing and a tray of food when they were settled. With the help of two strong young men from the livery stable, Jackson was transported to the inn and settled in his room, still under the influence of the laudanum and only half conscious of the movement. Hannah thanked the helpers, pressed coins into their hands, and finally found herself alone with Jackson in the small, plain room that would be his home for at least the next 2 weeks. In sleep, the lines of pain eased from his face, making him appear younger, more vulnerable. Hannah arranged the blankets carefully around him, made sure a glass of water was within reach on the bedside table, and reluctantly prepared to retire to her own room. As she turned to leave, Jackson's eyes fluttered open briefly, clouded with medication but seeking hers with unexpected clarity. "Hannah," he murmured, his voice slurred but warm. "Thank you. Sleep," she replied softly, allowing herself the liberty of brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I'll be next door if you need anything." "Stay," he whispered, his hand catching hers with surprising strength given his condition. "Just until I fall asleep again, please." It was a simple request, one Hannah could have easily refused. Propriety dictated she should. But as she looked down at the man who had come into her life so unexpectedly, who had offered partnership when she needed it most, who had endured days of solitary suffering with remarkable fortitude, she found she had no desire to refuse him this small comfort. "All right," she agreed, settling into the chair beside his bed, her hand still held in his. "I'll stay." Jackson's lips curved into a slight smile as his eyes drifted closed once more. "Good," he murmured, already sliding back toward sleep. "Don't want to wake up and find I dreamed you." Hannah watched as his breathing deepened and his grip on her hand relaxed, though she made no move to withdraw it. Outside the window, stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and from somewhere down the street came the faint strains of a piano playing in the saloon. It was, Hannah realized with a start, the most peaceful moment she had experienced in 3 long years. Despite the worry over Jackson's condition, despite the still unresolved matter of the loan and the uncertain future of her ranch, she felt a curious sense of rightness sitting here beside him, their hands joined in the quiet room. Perhaps it was exhaustion from the strenuous days behind her, or perhaps it was something more profound, a recognition that sometimes the most unexpected journeys led to destinations one never knew to seek. Whatever the cause, Hannah allowed herself to savor the feeling, to acknowledge the seed of something new taking root within her. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for now, in this moment, it was enough to simply be here, keeping watch over a man who had somehow, in the span of mere weeks, become important to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The 2 weeks that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Hannah spent her days tending to Jackson's needs, changing bandages, ensuring he took the medicines Dr. Morrow prescribed, and gradually helping him regain his strength through proper nourishment and rest. In the evenings, they would talk for hours about their respective pasts, their hopes for the ranch partnership, and increasingly about more personal matters. Jackson spoke of his childhood in Texas, the son of a small-time rancher who had lost everything in the war. He described his years on the trail, the camaraderie among the drovers, the endless skies, and the sense of freedom that came with them. But he also confessed the loneliness of that life, the growing desire for something more permanent as the years passed. "There comes a point," he told Hannah one evening as they shared a simple meal in his room, "when the trail stops feeling like freedom and starts feeling like running. I reached that point last year during a particularly brutal drive to Wyoming. Decided then that it was time to find a place of my own." Hannah understood the sentiment all too well. "William and I came west for similar reasons," she said, passing him a cup of coffee. "My father's farm in Pennsylvania was too small to divide among his children. William had experience with horses and a dream of open spaces." "You never regretted it?" Jackson asked. Leaving everything familiar behind, Hannah considered the question seriously. "There were difficult days, especially at first, the isolation, the harsh conditions. But no, I never truly regretted it. This land gets into your blood somehow." "That it does," Jackson agreed, his gaze lingering on her face in a way that made her cheeks warm slightly. As the days passed, Hannah found herself increasingly comfortable in his presence. The man she had initially regarded with cautious respect was revealing himself to be thoughtful, intelligent, and possessed of a quiet humor that often surprised a laugh from her when she least expected it. More disconcerting was her growing awareness of him as a man, his physical presence, the timbre of his voice, the warmth of his hand when it occasionally brushed hers. By the beginning of the second week, Jackson was able to move about the room with the aid of Crutch's doctor. Morrow had fashioned for him. His strength was returning rapidly, though he remained forbidden from putting any weight on the injured leg. It was during this time that Hannah finally addressed the matter that had initially brought Jackson to Denver: the loan payment and imminent foreclosure on her ranch. "The deadline is in 12 days, she said one morning as she changed the bandage on his leg. "Even if you were well enough to travel, which you're not, there's no time to go to Denver and back." Jackson frowned, clearly having been wrestling with the same problem. "What about a wire transfer? I could send a telegram to the bank in Denver where my funds are held." Hannah shook her head. "I already inquired. The Cottonwood Springs Bank doesn't have wire transfer capabilities. The closest bank that does is in Pueblo, a 3-day journey from my ranch." "Damn," Jackson muttered, frustration evident in his voice. "There has to be a way, Hannah." "I won't let you lose your ranch because I was careless enough to get caught in a flood." "You weren't careless," Hannah corrected him automatically. "No one can predict flash floods with certainty." She secured the fresh bandage and sat back. "Besides, I've been thinking about this. There might be another option." Jackson raised an eyebrow inquiringly. "Castle Rock has a bank," Hannah continued. "A real one, not just Harlan Wilson's glorified trading post. If I could convince them to grant me a temporary loan using my livestock as collateral, I could make the payment to satisfy the Denver investors. Then, when you're well enough to travel, you could still provide the capital as we originally planned, and I'd use it to repay the Castle Rock Bank." Jackson considered this, his expression thoughtful. "It's worth exploring," he agreed, "though banks are often reluctant to loan to women, especially widows." "Yes, I'm painfully aware of that prejudice," Hannah said dryly, "but it can't hurt to try. At worst, they'll say no, and we'll be no worse off than we are now." The Castle Rock Bank proved more receptive to Hannah's proposal than she had dared hope. The manager, Mr. Finley, was a practical man who cared more about the value of collateral than the gender of the borrower. After reviewing the detailed inventory Hannah had prepared of her livestock and equipment, he agreed to extend a loan of $900, enough to cover the debt and associated fees, with a small margin remaining. "Repayment in full within 90 days, Finley stipulated, pushing the paperwork across his desk. "Interest at 8%. If you default, the bank takes possession of all listed collateral." The terms were fair, if not generous. Hannah signed without hesitation, relief washing through her as the most immediate threat to her ranch was neutralized. With the bank draft secured in her reticule, she returned to the Wayfarers Inn to share the news with Jackson. His delight at her success was genuine and effusive. "I knew you'd find a way," he said, his smile warming her more than it should have. "You're a formidable woman, Hannah Green. Necessity breeds resourcefulness," she replied modestly, though his praise pleased her. "Now we just need to focus on getting you well enough to travel home." The word home slipped out unconsciously, but its implication hung in the air between them. Home, as if Cottonwood Springs was now home to them both, as if their separate ranches were somehow already united in purpose, beyond their business arrangement. Jackson seemed to catch the same nuance, his expression softening as he reached for her hand. "Hannah," he began, his voice taking on a gravity that made her pulse quicken. "These past weeks, confined here and dependent on your care, have given me a lot of time to think. About the partnership, yes, but also about a knock at the door interrupted whatever he had been about to say." Hannah withdrew her hand hastily as Mabel entered with fresh towels and a pot of coffee. "How's our patient today?" the innkeeper asked cheerfully, seemingly oblivious to the moment she had disrupted. "Improving daily," Jackson replied, though Hannah noted a hint of frustration in his voice at the interruption. "Thanks to excellent care," Mabel beamed at Hannah. "You've been a godsend to him, that's certain." "Never seen such dedication," she winked not so subtly. "Makes a body wonder if there's more than just business between you two." "Mabel," Hannah began, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Now, don't you mind me," the older woman continued, arranging the towels on the washstand. "I've been around long enough to recognize when two people are well suited. My Henry and I were just the same, started as neighbors helping each other out, ended up married 42 years. She patted Hannah's shoulder as she headed for the door. "Sometimes the best partnerships are the ones that grow into something more." With that parting wisdom, she departed, leaving an awkward silence in her wake. "Well," Hannah said finally, busying herself with pouring coffee to hide her discomfort, "Mabel certainly has her own ideas." Jackson accepted the cup she offered, his eyes holding hers over the rim. "Perceptive woman, our landlady," he commented mildly. Hannah found herself unable to maintain the pretense of casualness any longer. Setting down her own cup, she met his gaze directly. "Jackson, what were you going to say?" Before Mabel came in, he set his coffee aside as well, his expression serious but gentle. "I was going to say that these weeks have shown me something I suspected from the moment I met you on your porch, that you are an extraordinary woman, Hannah Green. Strong, capable, independent, but also kind and more generous of spirit than you perhaps give yourself credit for." Hannah felt her cheeks warm at his praise, but remained silent, sensing he had more to say. "Our partnership makes sound business sense," Jackson continued. "But I find myself hoping for something beyond that, something I haven't allowed myself to consider in a very long time." He reached for her hand again, and this time she didn't pull away. "I'm not a man given to flowery speeches or grand declarations, Hannah, but I care for you deeply and genuinely. And if you could see your way to allowing our partnership to grow in that direction, I would consider myself the most fortunate of men." The directness of his statement took Hannah's breath away. She had sensed the growing connection between them, had felt her own emotions shifting from cautious respect to something warmer, more personal. But to hear him express similar feelings so openly was both thrilling and terrifying. "Jackson," she began, her voice not quite steady, "I won't pretend I haven't felt something developing between us. But it's been such a short time, and there's so much at stake with the ranches. I'm not asking for an immediate answer," he interrupted gently, "or for any promises you're not ready to give. Just for you to be open to the possibility." Hannah looked down at their joined hands, his larger one enveloping hers with a warmth that seemed to seep into her very bones. How long had it been since she'd allowed herself to consider such possibilities? Since William's death, she had focused solely on survival, on holding onto the ranch, on getting through each day with her independence intact. The idea of opening her heart again, of risking the pain that loss could bring, was daunting. Yet sitting here with Jackson, feeling the steady strength of his hand around hers, she found the prospect less frightening than it might once have been. "I can be open to possibilities," she said finally, meeting his gaze once more. "But slowly, Jackson. There's so much happening right now, so many changes already." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual but ultimately transformative, illuminating his features in a way that made Hannah's heart beat a little faster. "Slowly is fine by me," he assured her. "We have time now, thanks to your resourcefulness with the Castle Rock Bank." Hannah smiled in return, a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't fully acknowledged until this moment. Not just the burden of the loan and the threat to her ranch, but the heavier weight of solitude, of facing each challenge alone. Whatever came next, whatever this tentative new understanding between them might grow into, she would no longer be standing entirely on her own. As Jackson raised her hand to his lips in a gesture both courtly and intimate, Hannah felt something long dormant within her stir to life hope, not just for the survival of her ranch, but for her own happiness as well. 3 days later, Dr. Morrow pronounced Jackson fit for travel, provided they took the journey slowly and stopped frequently to rest his leg. The Castle Rock Bank draft had been sent to Denver via registered mail, with confirmation received that the loan obligation had been satisfied in full. For the first time in months, Hannah could breathe without the constant pressure of impending foreclosure weighing on her. The journey back to Cottonwood Springs took 2 full days, with an overnight stop at a small way station along the route. They traveled in a rented buggy, Jackson's splinted leg propped carefully on cushions, Copper tethered behind them. The leisurely pace allowed for long conversations and comfortable silences alike, each mile bringing them closer not just to home, but to a deeper understanding of one another. News of their return spread quickly through the small community. By the time they reached Hannah's ranch, Sheriff Mercer was waiting on her porch, his expression a mixture of surprise and relief. "Mrs. Green," he called as they approached, "and Mr. Garner." "We'd about given you up for lost, sir." Jackson, with Hannah's assistance, descended carefully from the buggy. "As you can see, Sheriff, reports of my demise were premature," he replied with good humor. "Though it was a near thing, and would have been certain if not for Mrs. Green's determination to find me." The sheriff removed his hat respectfully. "That's a remarkable tale I'd like to hear in full sometime." He glanced between them, clearly noting their easy familiarity. "I also bring news from the bank. Mr. Wilson asked me to inform you that your loan has been fully satisfied." "Yes, we received confirmation in Castle Rock," Hannah replied, her tone professionally neutral despite her lingering suspicion of Wilson's involvement in the sudden acceleration of her loan. "Well then," Mercer said, replacing his hat, "I'll leave you folks to get settled. Mighty glad to see you both returned safely." With a tip of his hat, he mounted his horse and rode back toward town. Hannah helped Jackson to the porch and into the house, which felt both familiar and somehow different after their time away. Dust had settled on the furniture, and the air was still and warm, but it was her home, soon to be the base of their expanded operations once Jackson was fully recovered. "Sit," she instructed, guiding him to William's old armchair by the fireplace. "I'll open some windows and get us something to drink. You must be exhausted after the journey." Jackson settled into the chair with a sigh of relief, stretching his splinted leg before him. "It feels good to be here," he said, looking around the simple room with evident appreciation. "You've created a real home, Hannah." The simple compliment warmed her as she moved about the house, opening windows to the late afternoon breeze, pumping fresh water for them both. When she returned to the main room with 2 glasses, she found Jackson studying the faded daguerreotype on the small table beside his chair, the only image she had of William, taken shortly after their marriage. He had a kind face, Jackson observed, setting the frame carefully back in its place. I can see why you loved him. Hannah handed him a glass of water and took the chair opposite. He was a good man, honest, hardworking, with big dreams. She smiled slightly at the memory, not unlike someone else I've come to know. Jackson acknowledged the comparison with a slight inclination of his head. I would have liked to know him, he said sincerely. Any man who could win the heart of a woman like you must have been exceptional. The comment might have pained her once, might have reopened the wound of William's loss. Instead, Hannah found she could accept it for the genuine tribute. It was one good man recognizing the worth of another, without jealousy or insecurity. He would have approved of our partnership, she said after a moment's reflection. William always believed in progress, in finding new ways to make the ranch succeed. And of me? Jackson asked quietly. Do you think he would have approved of me? The question was laden with meaning beyond the words themselves. Hannah considered it seriously, looking at the man before her, travel worn, injured, yet radiating a steady strength and integrity that had become increasingly precious to her over these weeks. Yes, she said finally, meeting his gaze directly. I believe he would have. William wanted my happiness above all else. He made me promise before that last trip to Denver that if anything happened to him, I wouldn't spend my life alone. Jackson's expression softened. A wise man indeed. They sat in comfortable silence as the shadows lengthened across the floor. Eventually, Hannah rose to light the lamps and prepare a simple meal from the supplies they'd purchased in Castle Rock. The domestic routine felt different somehow, with Jackson's presence filling the house not an intrusion, but a complementary force that made the familiar space feel more complete. As they ate at the kitchen table, discussing plans for the coming week's hiring hands, beginning the irrigation improvements Jackson had proposed, bringing their herds together for more efficient management, Hannah was struck by how naturally they had fallen into working as a team. It was as if they had known each other for years rather than mere weeks, their thoughts and ideas flowing together seamlessly. What are you thinking? Jackson asked, noticing her momentary abstraction. Hannah smiled. That for all the difficulty of the past month, your accident, the loan crisis, everything, I find myself strangely grateful for how things have unfolded. Jackson raised an eyebrow inquiringly. Grateful for a flash flood and a broken leg? You're a more forgiving woman than most, Hannah Green. She laughed, the sound filling the kitchen with unexpected warmth. Not for the flood itself, of course, but for where it's led us. If you hadn't been injured, if I hadn't come searching for you. She hesitated, then continued with characteristic directness. We might have remained merely business partners, never discovering what else might be possible between us. The admission hung in the air between them, more open than anything she'd allowed herself to express since their conversation at the Wayfarer's Inn. Jackson reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Life has a way of taking unexpected turns, he said quietly. Sometimes for the worse, but sometimes, if we're fortunate, for the much, much better. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to Hannah's life. Jackson temporarily moved into her spare bedroom while his leg continued to heal. An arrangement that raised eyebrows in town, but which both of them maintained was purely practical. In truth, there was nothing improper in their living arrangement. Jackson was scrupulously respectful of her privacy and propriety, but the growing bond between them was evident to anyone who saw them together. With the financial pressure relieved, and Jackson's investments secured once he was able to travel to Denver and retrieve his funds, they began implementing their plans for the combined ranch operations. 2 experienced hands were hired to help with the daily work, allowing Hannah to focus on breeding and training the horses that were her particular expertise, while Jackson oversaw the irrigation improvements that would dramatically increase their grazing capacity. By the time autumn painted the aspen groves gold and crimson, Jackson's leg had healed sufficiently for him to ride short distances, though Dr. Morrow, who had made the journey from Castle Rock twice to check on his patient, warned against any cattle drives or extended time in the saddle until spring. "You're lucky to be walking without a limp," the doctor had said bluntly during his last visit. "Don't push your good fortune by rushing back to full activity too soon." This enforced moderation meant Jackson spent more time at the ranch house than he might have otherwise, often working on account books or drafting plans for future improvements, while Hannah handled the physical aspects of ranch management. Their evenings were spent in companionable conversation, sometimes joined by their ranch hands for meals, but often just the two of them, growing ever more comfortable in each other's presence. It was during one such evening in late October, with the first snow of the season dusting the distant peaks and a fire crackling in the hearth, that Jackson finally broached the subject they had been circling for weeks. "Hannah," he began, setting aside the book he'd been reading, "there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you." She looked up from her mending, noting the serious tone of his voice. "What is it?" Jackson shifted in his chair, leaning forward slightly. "Our partnership has been successful beyond what either of us might have expected. The ranch is thriving, the bank loan is fully repaid, and our plans for expansion next spring are well in hand." "Yes," Hannah agreed, setting her sewing in her lap. "We've accomplished a great deal in a short time." "We have," Jackson confirmed. "But I find myself thinking more and more about the future, not just of the ranch, but of us. Hannah, these past months have been the happiest of my life, despite the broken leg and all the complications we've faced." Hannah's heart began to beat a little faster, though she kept her expression composed. "They've been good months for me as well," she admitted quietly. "I'm glad to hear that," Jackson said, his smile warm but tinged with nervousness she rarely saw in him. "Because I've come to realize something important, that while our business partnership is valuable and worth preserving, it's not enough for me anymore." He rose from his chair, and with only the slightest hint of his recent injury in his gait, crossed to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "Hannah Green, I love you," he said simply, his blue eyes steady on hers. "I love your strength, your intelligence, your kindness. I love the way you face challenges head-on, the way you've built this place with your own hands, the way you came searching for me when others would have given up." Hannah felt tears gathering in her eyes, unexpected but not unwelcome. "Jackson, please let me finish," he said gently. "I know it hasn't been long by some standards. I know the memory of William is still with you as it should be. But I believe with all my heart that what we've found together is rare and precious. I'm not asking you to forget the past, only to consider building a future with me, not just as business partners, but as husband and wife." The words hung in the air between them, sincere and unadorned, much like the man himself. Hannah looked at him kneeling before her, this man who had appeared on her porch months ago with bread and wildflowers, who had offered partnership when she needed it most, who had endured pain and hardship with quiet courage, and who now offered his heart with the same straightforward honesty he brought to everything. In that moment, Hannah knew her answer with absolute clarity. The time for cautious steps and careful considerations was past. Some decisions, once recognized, demanded wholehearted commitment. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion welling within her. "Yes, Jackson, I will marry you." The joy that illuminated his face was answer enough to any lingering doubts she might have harbored. Jackson rose, drawing her to her feet and into his arms with a gentle urgency that spoke volumes about the restraint he had exercised these many weeks. "I love you," he said again, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I have since that first evening on your porch, though I scarcely understood it then." "And I love you," Hannah replied, the words both foreign and familiar on her tongue. "It happened so gradually, and yet so completely, that I can hardly remember how it felt before you came into my life." When he kissed her, it was with a tenderness that belied the strength in his arms as they held her close. Hannah responded with a passion that surprised even herself. years of carefully maintained reserve melting away in the warmth of his embrace. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Cottonwood Springs, a simple ceremony attended by their ranch hands, Dr. Morrow, who made the journey specially from Castle Rock, and a handful of neighbors who had come to respect the unusual partnership that had blossomed into something more. Hannah wore a new dress of deep blue silk, ordered from Denver for the occasion, with the columbines and Indian paintbrush Jackson had brought her on his first visit, recreated in the small bouquet she carried. Jackson stood tall and proud beside her, all traces of his injury gone save for the specially made cane Dr. Morrow had insisted he use for formal occasions, to remind him not to be a damned fool about that leg in the future. As they spoke their vows, Hannah felt not the nervous anticipation of a young bride, but the serene certainty of a woman who had found her equal in strength, in purpose, and in love. The gold band Jackson placed on her finger joined the one from William, which she had moved to her right hand in a gesture that honored the past while embracing the future. "I, Jackson, take you, Hannah, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the small church. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When Hannah repeated the same words, her voice was steady and sure, her eyes never leaving his. This was no desperate gamble or compromise of convenience, but a choice made with full awareness of both its challenges and its joys. That evening, as they stood together on the porch of what was now truly their home, watching the stars emerge in the clear November sky, Jackson wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her close against the chill. "Happy, Mrs. Garner?" he asked softly, using her new name with evident pleasure. Hannah leaned into his embrace, savoring the warmth and solidity of him beside her. "Very," she replied simply. "And you, Mr. Garner, any regrets about tying yourself to a stubborn widow with a struggling ranch?" Jackson chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her side. "Only that I didn't knock on your door sooner." Hannah smiled, remembering that first evening, how close she had come to sending him away, how differently things might have unfolded if she had followed her initial instinct to maintain her solitary independence. "You brought bread and flowers," she said reflectively. "Such simple things, yet somehow exactly what I needed, though I didn't know it then." "And you offered coffee and conversation," Jackson replied, which was precisely what a lonely man needed after years on the trail. They stood in comfortable silence for a time, watching their breath form small clouds in the crisp air. The ranch spread before them, peaceful in the gathering darkness, the barn where their combined horse herd now sheltered, the new corral Jackson had designed for the spring foals, the fields that would, with proper irrigation, support both their dreams for years to come. "What are you thinking?" Jackson asked eventually, noticing her contemplative expression. Hannah turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to trace the strong line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "That life takes unexpected turns," she said, echoing his words from months before. "And that sometimes, those turns lead exactly where we need to go, even when we don't recognize it at first." Jackson caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, his eyes warm with an emotion that still took her breath away when directed so openly toward her. "In my case," he said softly, "that turn led me to a dusty porch where a remarkable woman sat alone, needing bread, flowers, and perhaps a reminder that solitude isn't the only way to face life's challenges." "And in my case," Hannah replied, rising on tiptoe to brush her lips against his, "it led me to discover that partnership, true partnership, can be the greatest strength of all." As Jackson gathered her more fully into his arms, deepening the kiss with a tenderness that held the promise of passion to come, Hannah knew with absolute certainty that the long years of struggle and solitude had been worth enduring for the joy she had found. Not in spite of the hardships, but because of them, because they had shaped her into a woman capable of recognizing and embracing the rare gift of a love built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the courage to begin again. The bread and flowers that had once seemed such simple tokens had, in fact, been the first offerings in what would become a lifetime of giving and receiving of strength when weakness threatened, of hope when despair loomed, of unwavering support through whatever challenges the future might hold. And as they turned together toward the warmth of their home, Hannah Green Garner felt not the weight of the past, but the buoyant promise of all that lay ahead, a promise as vast and full of possibility as the western sky above them, stretching endlessly toward tomorrow.